And welcome to tonight's digital discussion. My name is John Harry with Milwaukee County Historical Society. We're broadcasting this not only on the Historical Society's Facebook and YouTube page, but also the UW Milwaukee's Department of History page as well. So no matter where you're watching, thanks for joining us tonight for our very interesting presentation we have coming up about our podcast collaboration with the UW Milwaukee History Department, the Healthiest City, Milwaukee and its pandemics. Going to talk about the last big pandemic to come through Milwaukee in the 1918 flu pandemic, as well as what it's like to be a podcaster and what podcasts are, and we'll get into that. While we're getting settled in and stuff, I want to just go through a few announcements that we have at the Historical Society. Our next talk is a week from today. Very timely talk because it's baseball season finally, but it's about women's baseball in Milwaukee and the Midwest. So that is next Thursday night. So if you made it here tonight, you can make it here next week too. It's same time and place on our MCHS Facebook and YouTube channel for that talk about women's baseball. We also still have our exhibit up about water in Milwaukee. So Milwaukee, where the waters meet, that'll be up until April 24th. So you have a limited amount of time still to see that one. So make sure that you get down to the Historical Society and see that while you can. And we did do a collaborative beer effort, which turned out great with Indeed Brewing Company on South 2nd Street in Walker's Point. It's a foreign extra stout. It's called the Lady Elgin, named after the ship disaster that was the greatest single loss of life on the Great Lakes in 1860. So we're honoring that story with that beer. So they still have a couple kegs left is what they told me. So get down there and get them while you can. It's a little cold, so a nice dark beer will do you good anyway. That's it for me for now, but we're going to bring in our guests, and we have the podcasters who made the Healthiest City with Chris Cantwell, professor of history at UW Milwaukee, and I'll let him introduce the grad students involved that helped put this whole thing together.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having us, John, and thanks for the Historical Society for both hosting us as well as being a partner in this project over the last 6 months or however long it's taken to put together. My name is Chris Cantwell. I'm an assistant professor of public and digital history at UW Milwaukee, and I'm joined by two of we call them pod storians on the show, as a kind of a mashup between podcasters who are interested in audio storytelling, but then historians who are, using audio to tell stories. So it's Ken and Christina who managed to work on two episodes of the show, and I'll let them say a bit about themselves as well. Ken, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thank you, John. My name's Ken Bartelt. I'm a PhD student and teaching assistant at UW Milwaukee. I also was in the Museum Studies program there and got my master's degree in public history. I also work part-time at the Milwaukee County Historical Society, so if you come on down on a Thursday, you've probably seen me work in the front desk. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about the Healthiest City today with Christina and Chris.
Yeah, and so Christina, that's your cue.
Hey, my name's Christina Grev. I'm a second-year graduate student here at UWM, getting my master's in library science and public history. I got my undergrad over at UW La Crosse. And I had a lot of fun working on this.
So I guess to start, I shouldn't have said I'm going to turn things over to Chris. I was like, no, that wasn't the plan. I'm going to kind of lead you through how you did this tonight, or how you put this whole project together. It's fascinating, and it's been great to partner with the university to get something like this, because we've all as a historical institution, we always we should really do a podcast, and so it's been really great to have a partner in that aim. So Chris, why did you decide that this was a thing that you wanted a class to do? Why'd you make this?
Right. Yeah. This is there was a bunch of different forces that all kind of came together to make a show like this possible. On the one hand, this is one of those instances where, necessity is really the mother of invention, right? So we were entering this academic year, and I knew I would have to be teaching completely virtually. And so I was trying to think of ways to come up with opportunities for our graduate students who want to work in museums and libraries, historical societies, to have them have an opportunity to make something real at a time when everything is virtual. And podcasts really seem to be the obvious choice for that. On the one hand, podcast is kind of downloadable radio, if you will, kind of like long form storytelling, or the different kind of shows you can get on your iPhone apps for podcasts, is really one of the growing mediums right now. It's one of the fastest growing media genres that are around. And you'll find that, as John was just mentioning, a lot of museums have their own podcasts. And so this seemed like an opportunity that by partnering with the Milwaukee County Historical Society, an opportunity both for maybe MCHS to have some digital content during this kind of socially distant year, at the same time providing some resources so that my students could actually make something at a moment when they were spread across the country right now. And then the pandemic really kind of lent itself as the obvious choice, because it was what we were all thinking about. And if we were going to make a show that was relevant to the community in which we lived, it made sense to kind of see, well, Milwaukee's gone through this already. What can we learn about the past that might help us survive the present?
Sure. So I think to start, if people haven't heard it yet, maybe we should give them a sample.
Yeah. So we could start with the preview, I thought, give everybody a sense of kind of a quick hit of the show. So I'm going to advance my PowerPoint here and just hope and pray that everything works. So this is a teaser preview we put out in February after the class was over as a way to hopefully generate interest in the show. And then the episodes have all come out since then.
Nobody had built a playbook for this before. How do you survive as a nonprofit theater in a pandemic, right? They don't teach you that in grad school management classes. Nobody's had to do that since maybe 1918.
In the winter of 1918, the city of Milwaukee found itself in the midst of a crisis almost exactly like our own.
All places and establishments of every nature within the city of Milwaukee, carried on by any person or persons or corporations detrimental to the public health and likely to spread such contagious disease, be closed during the period of the present emergency.
A highly contagious and deadly disease that had spread across the globe found its way into the city.
Mother got a telegram. It said, "Your son is sick, come out here." And by the time she got there, he was already dead.
This disease was the great influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919. And like the coronavirus pandemic today, it completely upended life in our city.
Because of the prevalence of influenza, our regular force was considerably reduced in many departments, necessitating employing an unusual number of extras for the holiday season.
Schools shut down, businesses closed, hospitals filled up, and people died.
He did kind of catch a cold at work, and it had progressively gotten worse. He was at home and passed away there.
What can we learn about our own moment by looking to the past? What can the history of Milwaukee's other pandemic teach us about the crisis we're currently facing? Well, from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Department of History, in partnership with the Milwaukee County Historical Society, comes a new 7-part podcast about our city and its pandemics, and it's called The Healthiest City.
The workers of this city are its most valuable asset, and whenever possible, extend to them the opportunity of life.
You've alluded to what steps Milwaukee took to reduce the likelihood of the broader spread of the virus. Those principles are still present today.
Literally, you have this lost generation of all these young men and many young women as well, who lost their lives.
Financially, when you don't know, like I say, if it's going to be a few weeks or a few months, that's the scary part.
Public health is political, period.
Theaters are closed, schools are closed, churches are closed, not the saloons though, and it's because they need that license revenue.
And I stood there for a moment and I just absorbed that feeling, because I had never felt that before. And I remember I prayed for the first time in a few years, and I just remember praying that at least some patients would survive.
The Healthiest City. It's a show about how Milwaukee's past might just help us survive the present, and it's coming soon.
So it's out. So that's an old preview. It's out. So episode 7 actually comes on Monday.
The show wraps up. Yeah.
So we're hitting. You have time to catch up before the next episode comes out on Monday. Maybe to start to talk about some of the content within the program is, how did Milwaukee do? How did our ancestors fare during the 1918 flu pandemic?
Yeah, I can take that one to start. I think, Milwaukee had kind of earned this reputation as the healthiest city, as the name of our podcast kind of implies, because of the work of the various socialist administrations in the early 20th century. Milwaukee had a reputation for a very strong public health system. It had one of the cleanest sewer systems in the country. So it took public health seriously. And really, the Spanish flu is another example of that. And I just was reviewing some documents today in preparation for this. And on October 9th of 1918, the Common Council of Milwaukee, they had an emergency meeting as the first flu cases were coming in. And Health Commissioner George Ruland, he warned the Common Council saying that he estimated that 40% of the city's population, or 180,000 people, would be infected. And they were preparing for 2,000 deaths from the Spanish flu. Now, the Common Council responded to this and gave him quite a bit of authority to put some public health measures in place to keep people safe. And those health measures largely worked. The actual number of deaths was 1,173, so almost cutting in half that prediction. And Milwaukee had a Spanish flu death rate of 2.56 deaths per 1,000 residents, which is actually the second best ratio in the country. So, I mean, maybe we should have been the second healthiest city, but still, I mean, those numbers are pretty strong and show how, a kind of robust public health response really was effective.
So why did Milwaukee fare so well then? What was in place that made it such a success?
I'll say I could take over for that one. So it's something that we actually realized really early on when we were doing research for this podcast was if we wanted to get into the story of the 1918 Spanish flu in Milwaukee, we had to go back. We actually had to go back to the 1894 smallpox outbreak here in Milwaukee and take a look at that and see what we learned from that outbreak and how it was applied to the Spanish influenza. So, in 1894, during this time, living conditions were not the greatest. And this is especially true for immigrant populations and the conditions that they were living in. And the public health officials printed out informational pamphlets on how to stay healthy and how to avoid the smallpox. However, they were not printed out in multiple languages. So this was really eliminating a lot of populations. And the relationship between these immigrants and public health officials was not the greatest. And at times they clashed. And Maddie and Olivia, our classmates, they did a fantastic job in episode 1. They actually told the story of one such instance of the clash between immigrants and public health officials. And at this time, you had German and Polish families that were not trusting in the government and the government not creating health policies that cater to these populations. And feelings towards hospitals during this time were also different. And then, like Ken mentioned before, in the span between the smallpox and the Spanish influenza, you had changes in sanitary conditions because of the socialists and them reforming public health concerns. So the culmination of the 1894 smallpox outbreak and the Socialist Party really kind of helped prevent the 1918 influenza from becoming a bigger thing, because during this time you had George Ruland taking control, and there's his rules for preventing the Spanish influenza. And he took everything that he learned from the past outbreaks and applied it towards this influenza. If you'll notice, you'll have the rules and regulations. They're just kind of like what you see today, like get plain fresh air, but at the same time, don't be face to face with people, cough and sneeze if you do, but do it in a handkerchief. And he put up rules and regulations such as closing down schools and bars and places of entertainment and such as like that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I think, Christina's right on, but it also makes us seem like we had a great deal of foresight in what we were going to cover. I mean, I have to be honest that, part of the reason the podcast goes so far back, as we mentioned, our first episode is about the smallpox outbreak in 1994, is because when we sat down and started plotting out our show, what our story was going to be, we kind of realized, like, this could be pretty boring, right? Like, the disease arrived, the city said shut down, everybody followed the rules, and everything was fine, right? And it was all over after that. And we were like, well, that's not a really compelling story to share and tell. So what we decided was one of the key themes we could really follow was like, well, what was it about Milwaukee? And, why was it that this place did so well? Given just a generation earlier, it ended up having this disaster. And what we came to find out is that the city actually learned a fair amount of lessons from that disaster. And, one of the slide we showed a little earlier, I'll jump back here a moment to one of the other ones. So this was a placard that the city would put up that if your house had a member who was sick with the flu, that they would sort of warn everybody, don't come to this house because somebody is sick. But what's important about this is the city did this during the second wave of the flu in 1919. And so it was kind of part of what the city was doing is like, hey, you didn't follow the rules the first time and you got sick. So we're going to shame you for not having followed the rules. And it's just remarkable for us to think about, like, would we allow our city government to shame us for not, have like flags hanging out our house if we weren't wearing masks or, carrying hand sanitizers in our pockets and things like that. So the arc of the story was in one of those other instances is like, what is our story? And if the city did well, what accounts for that? And that required us to go back.
That's interesting. You talk about the shame of it, because there's definitely, there is an element of shame still today, as far as like how people handle it, depending on what camp you're in, as far as how you've handled the current pandemic, which leads nicely into my next question. Actually, is what is similar between this pandemic and the past, the 1918 pandemic?
Yeah. What really was interesting to me, one of the things we decided to do early on in the show when we were deciding, like, what was our show going to sound like, how we were going to structure each episode, because you had 15 people, making 7 episodes for one show. And so how are you going to kind of corral that so it had a consistency from start to finish rather than just being 7 completely random podcasts? And one of the kind of structures we came up with is that we actually open each episode with an interview with somebody in Milwaukee today who is sort of, navigating the coronavirus pandemic. And we did that for 2 reasons. One was because to make the connection between the past and the present, that, a lot of the emotions we're feeling now would have been the kind of sentiments and fears and thoughts that other people would have had, because these were very similar circumstances. But then we also use those interviews as a guide to try to figure out, like, well, what should the topics of our shows be, right? So we know that, for example, schooling is sort of one of the central questions of the coronavirus pandemic. When people are going to go back to school, under what conditions, the whole conversation about virtual learning, which, spoiler alert, they didn't have in 1918. And so we use that as really a guide. And that actually one of my favorite episodes that Ken ended up working on is we ended up sort of trying to find people who worked at institutions who were, going through the coronavirus pandemic, whose businesses or organizations were also around during the 1918 flu pandemic. And so this image here, the building on the left, is Puddler's Hall Tavern, which claims to be the second oldest tavern in Milwaukee. And so I happen to know the owner. I play hockey with him. He's a really good guy. And so he decided, and he's a history fan of history as well. And so he agreed to sort of partner with my students on this and let us sort of interview him, right, to ask how he's navigating the pandemic, but then use that as a jumping off point to say, how did Milwaukee survive, or how Puddler's Hall survived the flu pandemic 100 years earlier. And so a lot of our episodes really track those kind of major themes that we're experiencing now, and then looks back, right? So we have an episode about teachers in schools and, what do teachers in school students do when there's no virtual learning in a pandemic? We have an episode on hospitals and nurses. And there's an episode on bars and theaters and restaurants as well.
So, that's how you guys kind of navigated the similarities and differences between this pandemic and the past one. But what's my question? What is different about this pandemic?
I can take that. I mean, a couple things jump out right away. First of all, is the political climate was quite different. I mean, if you look at our contemporary politics, we're pretty divided. I don't think I need to tell anybody that if you pay attention to the news. And if you go back to the Spanish flu, it's not that there weren't divisions in the country. There certainly were. But this was going on during World War I, when there was kind of this patriotic fervor, more or less. So there was kind of a unified effort that, like, all right, we as Americans are all contributing to the war effort. And that really carried over to handling the flu as well. There was more of a cohesion that I don't think you could see today. Also, the duration, there's a big difference. I mean, and I think the economic impacts, we're going to have to see what happens with the coronavirus, because if you look at the Spanish flu in Milwaukee really only shut down for 5 weeks or a couple months. We're already over a year with some form of shutdown or limit on the economy with the Spanish flu or with the coronavirus. And I guess one more thing I thought of, just based on what Chris had said about teachers, is it just seemed like there was a lot of creativity with the handling of the Spanish flu. Like, one thing that they did when they closed schools was they enlisted all of the public school teachers to go and be contact tracers, where they would kind of go house to house and record information on who was sick and bring that data back to the health department. So kind of using your resources, and that way you could keep teachers employed as well. So there was, not that there's no creative thinking today, but there was a lot of creative thinking, like the teacher example in 1918.
I'll say, Ken, I'm going to add one more to what you were saying, and that is the spread of information as well in social media right now. My roommate last year, when this all started, she knew automatically. She follows the news all the time, and she knew straight away when it started over in China. And then when you have it going on right now in the Spanish flu of 1918 and taking a look at that history, well, we have theories as to where the origins of it came from. And right now, the most prevalent one is it started in Kansas City, United States. But, there's still these it might have started here, it might have started there. We're not really that sure. But the spread of information is so fast nowadays that we automatically knew when it hit the United States and when to get prepared and when to get ready.
Yeah, and I think, I think Ken's being a little modest. I feel a little more comfortable in saying that we have really failed our forefathers and foremothers in the way in which we've handled this pandemic versus the other. Because I meant to put this picture up earlier. I apologize, but this is a photograph from the Milwaukee newspaper that shows teachers being retrained as nurses and doing house visits to just count how many people were sick in Milwaukee. And I think one, it sort of speaks to the trust and authority and the kind of power that local governments had during this time period, that they could marshal these forces and there wasn't widespread rejection or protesting against them. But it also, I think, really does, in some ways, the kind of the freedom to act in that way by public officials allows for this kind of creativity, that your problem can really be your solution, right? How many millions of people have we had unemployed over the last year that could have been contributing in some way to getting out of this mess, both here in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and elsewhere. And it really just to speak to, as much as things are similar, that there has been kind of a tectonic shift in the ways in which Americans understand what government is for and what government can do, or what they're allowed to do now. Right now, the fear is, don't infringe upon my freedom. But the citizens in Milwaukee at the turn of the 20th century knew that if there was a raging pandemic, that no one was really free, right? Like, no one was free until the pandemic was under control. And so there was a willingness to consent to the experts and the guidance at that time to, make a quick recovery possible. So
I would also like to point out something we didn't mention yet, but it's not like we didn't have challenges during the 1918 Spanish influenza here in Milwaukee. We did. And one of them that Ken and I noticed during our episode was the lack of hospital spaces. And so Rulin actually had to go and get some money to open up some isolation hospitals. And then also you had to staff these areas. So there were a lot of nurses and doctors that were off fighting in France and during World War I, so leaving us with barely anybody.
Yeah, there's a different challenge going on entirely, across the world too. I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but if anybody has any questions, just pop those in the comments. We're going to do a Q&A here in just a little bit. So if you've been dying to ask a question of one of these folks, make sure that you get your questions in. Just pop them in the comments there. It's interesting to talk about the differences between these two pandemics. But nobody in 1918 was making a podcast. And graduate school certainly looked very, very different. So my question is, what was it like to make a podcast about a pandemic during a pandemic?
Professor Cantwell kind of mentioned it, but I think it was definitely interesting. I will put it that way. So we weren't in the kind of classroom space that we usually be in. We were all online in different areas. Some of us were even in Wisconsin at this time. So trying to gather resources was something that would have been difficult. But thankfully, we live in the digital world where a lot of our resources were thankfully digitized and online. We were able to go through all these old newspapers and just find them simply and easier that way instead of actually going in. Thankfully, the Milwaukee County Historical Society, was on and off open during that time. One of the resources I used was the National Museum of the American Sailor down in around Chicago area. And unfortunately, they were not open, but they had all of their resources online. And I don't know how I would have been able to do research for this episode with my co-producer, Katie, without those digital archives. Additionally, we had so many different people reaching out to us and were able to help us to interview with as well, just around the United States. I think Ken and probably Professor Cantwell can talk more about talking to Casey from Puddler's Hall.
Yeah, I personally did not interview Casey, but Frank, who was one of my co-producers on that episode where he's featured, did. We're actually planning, our whole team, me, Frank, and Bree, who worked on that episode, we're all fully vaccinated. So we're going to plan a trip to Puddler's Hall to celebrate this project being done.
I want to go.
Yeah, well, John, we'll invite you as well. Yes. Get the vaccine and you can come hang out with us.
I'm already there, man.
Right. One of the things that, was challenging with that was, trying to go and interview somebody in a bar, because we tried to talk to him. We wanted to talk to him in the bar so we could try to get like background noise to get like the ambiance of a bar. And that plan didn't really go so well because there weren't many people at the bar. Because of obviously, people have been staying home. But I will just say in general, one of the big challenges of working on this during a pandemic was a term you're probably all familiar with now. It's like Zoom fatigue. Christina and I would be meeting to write a script, and, that takes some time, but you get tired of just trying to talk back and forth on a computer screen and type in a shared document after an hour. So you have to kind of split up your work. Whereas if you're in person and, you can take little breaks just to have a side conversation, you can order food, have a pizza party or something, it makes it go a lot easier. But when you're just, doing this from your home on a computer screen, the work, it's really challenging.
Yeah, I wanted to, amplify something that Christina already mentioned, as well as celebrate the work of Ken and Christina and the other students who were involved in the show, is that, there was a lot of this really would not have been possible without the assistance of the Milwaukee County Historical Society. And in some ways, like I wasn't going to move forward with doing something real if I did not have a partner like MCHS. One, because I knew that they would have the resources to make this possible. And in the instance when a lot of our students weren't even in Milwaukee, they weren't even in Wisconsin, some of them. And so I really want to sort of, thank MCHS for being such a willing partner for the community and opening its doors and being a service to the community in that way. And we would be absolutely remiss if we did not specifically thank Kevin Abing, who is the director of the archives, who sat down for an interview over the phone, or I think a couple in person too, but with every single student in that class. And that man is a saint for putting up with that much time. But then there's also a way, as much as Ken and Christina were talking about the challenges, the virtual environment we were all living in actually opened up a lot of opportunities too. So this kind of haunting image here, actually, now that I realize the picture that's up, this is the photograph of one of our classes that we were meeting. And since I knew, the whole world was going to be virtual in the fall, on a whim, I emailed the gentleman by the name of Leon Nafok, who is the host of the Slow Burn podcast. That was a huge hit 2 or 3 years ago when podcasts began to take off as a genre. And he did like a 12-part story around the time of President Trump's first impeachment. He began doing a podcast about all of the other impeachments that happened. So he covered Nixon, he covered Clinton. And I had sort of reached out to him when I was putting together this show. And I'm like, hey, do you want to zoom into my classroom and tell my students like how you do what you do? And so we, thanks to the fact that we were virtual, I didn't have to pay to fly him out or anything like that. We were able to just kind of connect with all these people. And I think that was true of a lot of the episodes as well. We were able to interview people in Madison and Seattle because, everybody's just a Zoom call away right now, where, maybe if we were in normal times, we may have not have thought about making those connections.
If I could just chime in a little bit and talk about, we talked a little bit about why we chose podcasting as a format, but I kind of want to go a little bit more into that because it is kind of a new media, but it is really interesting. And I like the way that Professor Cantwell kind of explained it as like a radio show in a way, but it's very versatile and you can take it anywhere. I personally love listening to podcasts because I listen while I'm driving in my car or else I'm doing my chores or, cleaning up around the house. But it's definitely a new medium that I think more people should really get into and should be interested in because, again, it's just, little stories inside your pocket you could take around everywhere with you.
And I got to imagine, one gives you another way to consume content, right? Rather than having to look at something, my wife loves podcasts because she can get stuff done around the house or go for a walk or whatever like that. So like, that's nice. And then as what Chris was saying too, with having the accessibility to guests like this, I have to imagine that's something that's not going to disappear from your lesson plans from future classes.
Oh yeah, henceforth. And and that to me is like the one episode we didn't do that we maybe could have done is sort of, what are the what things hung around after the Spanish flu that might suggest like what things are going to hang around after the coronavirus, right? And I think part of the reason we chose not to do that one is because it's just so unexpected, right? Like we don't know what the future holds. And, if history teaches us anything, it teaches us to be surprised, right? That like we're always going to expect the unexpected, right? And so I think I was wary of having everybody suddenly prognosticating about where we would go and then just, looking like fools by the time the show came out, right? Like everything's gonna be fine. And then, of course it's not. Like actually history teaches you it can always get worse. Like that's what my advisor always told me.
That's heartening. So as you all were going through this show, because you do like kind of a narrative arc of every episode throughout the pandemic of 1918, and obviously there isn't, there wasn't radio then, there wasn't TV that you could pull audio from, so you had a lot of voice actors and things like that. Do you have a favorite like moment from the pandemic or like a favorite clip that you'd like to play?
Yeah, so we had a whole conversation. We had a debate and a vote. We all had different favorite clips, and then we had to argue about which one we were going to play. But we decided upon a clip from the 5th episode that Ken and Christina actually worked on together. And this kind of speaks to. We like this clip for a couple of different reasons. One, it kind of showcases the kind of creativity you have to have when telling audio stories about a time period that had no audio, right? There are very few records. There's no live broadcast. There's no movie or television, just that we could sort of get our hands on that was relevant for this. And so we had to do a lot of sort of dramatic reading. So if we found Particularly, we had Ken served as our voice of the Milwaukee Sentinel for every episode. John, you were Mayor Seidel. That was you in the preview there. I'm sure everybody thought you were interrupting the preview by talking.
Socialism never sounded so good.
Yeah, yeah. But the clip we're going to play for you is actually what became one of my favorite pieces of the show. Actually, because my wife is voicing it too, as a heads up. But Ken managed to find, when doing research at the Milwaukee County Historical Society, this diary of a young woman named Maddie Fuller, who actually worked as an ambulance driver during the pandemic and kind of documented that in her diary. And so that, by like having an actor read her voices, that became like our interview, right? Like the ways in which reporters go out and interview people in the field, historians go into archives and read people's diaries and letters. And so the clip we have for you here is the moment in the episode that features Fuller's experience on nurses and doctors during the pandemic, and it kind of translates, what she was experiencing here. And so it's just a brief clip, I'll play for you now.
This combination of the flu's magnitude and the extended reach of the city's public health efforts greatly impacted those women and men who worked in hospitals and clinics. In the archives of the Milwaukee County Historical Society, for instance, lies the diary of Maddie Fuller, a young woman who married into Milwaukee's wealthy and well-connected Fuller family. In the fall of 1918, she worked as a nurse at Camp Grant Military Base outside the city of Rockford, Illinois, where the flu was running rampant.
October 4th, 1918. All of camp quarantined. Wear masks all day and night.
For most of the month of October, Fuller reported working 15 to 20 hours a day transporting and caring for the sick. And the work was more than just mentally and emotionally exhausting. It required a surprising amount of physical labor as well.
October 16th, 1918. Very heavy work, but some of the house guard have been detached to help us carry the stretchers. Makes things much easier.
Some days, Fuller recorded sleeping only a few hours a night in a hotel in her uniform. Other nights, she recorded not sleeping at all, haunted by the sounds of death outside her door.
October 8th, 1918. Still kept awake at hotel by rumble of trucks taking dead to depot.
Yeah, and the episode actually goes on a little bit more with this, but I sort of stopped it there. And the other reason I show this image is because one of my favorite parts, I don't know if you can see my mouse on the screen, it doesn't look like you can, but in that second diary entry, Fuller ends up getting the flu herself shortly after working in the hospital, as a lot of frontline workers both now and then are. And you can see there in her entry, I have the flu, and then she has a number of squiggly lines and exclamation points and X's. And I just love the kind of, she's swearing basically in her diary. And I love that humanizing moment that she's saying, GD or whatever you imagine somebody saying about this realization that she's now fallen, prey to this this deadly disease as well. But, thankfully she survives.
That's such a cool way of presenting the story too, is the going in and out of the quote with the narrator, and I applaud you all for making this sound so it doesn't sound like a grad school class made it. Let's put it that way. It sounds legit. It sounds great. So now I think we'll move into our Q&A portion. If anybody does have a question, I see one question is, where are all the other producers at? Well, how many people were in this class? There's a lot.
Yeah,
so that would have been a long presentation, right?
No, and I can see the name of who's asking these questions as well. So Anna is actually one of our featured people who are surviving Corona now, who serves as a jumping off point for helping us understand the past. So I'm actually thrilled to see Anna here and a part of this. So thanks for joining us. For us, it was just, there were 15 people total in the class that we broke out into 7 episodes. Everybody worked in kind of production teams. And if anybody who has attended a Zoom meeting with more than 3 people know, what's the saying? Like 2's a party, 3's a crowd, and 4 is chaos. I don't know. Ken and Christina, the reason I invited Ken and Christina, is they actually, as I mentioned, ended up doing double duty. That, they made an episode for the show And then after our class was over, one of the episodes needed basically to be recreated just because of the variety of challenges over this past year. And Ken and Christina agreed to put in some extra work to finish that episode up. And so I thought, they can speak the most knowledge since they've worked on the most episodes.
Sure. Well, Ken pulls double duty with the Historical Society and the project too. So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's a good connection too. What was it like? Kind of piggyback on the question about other people being involved in this, as far as maybe Christina and Ken can talk about. What was it like going through a class virtually with your co-hosts or co-producers? In this point, your classmates. What was that experience like in making this?
Oh my God. I think I would have had more breakdowns if we didn't have all of our classmates in that class with us, because it was so nice to have other voices. And pretty much at every class, we'd like bring our research in, be like, hey, this is what we have. What do you think of this story? Should we cut it? Should we not? And then afterwards, we got the rough drafts going on. We'd actually listen to every episode and be like, you should put music in there. You should cut that story, make it a little bit shorter. And it was so nice to have that commentary on how to like create this, because none of us had created a podcast before. We don't know what sounds good to one person and not to another.
Yeah, I think one of the good things too is the history department at UW Milwaukee is pretty tight knit, and if you've taken, as you take classes, you get to know everybody kind of. So I already had a pretty good relationship with most people in the class. And certainly the people I worked on my episodes with. So having been able to build that relationship in the before times was helpful. And I think had I not had such a good relationship with the people I worked for, this would have been a much bigger challenge.
Sure. And I see one more question here. Maybe this is a good place to wrap up too. Before we have maybe some closing thoughts. Bonnie, who's our friend at the Waukesha County Historical Society, is asking, what's in store for season 2? Obviously, we have a water exhibit. If you haven't heard, the water exhibit's coming back for a second go round next spring again, just because the pandemic was so limiting as far as who could see it and all that stuff. And so, God willing, everything will be a lot easier to navigate next spring. But what's in store for season 2?
Yeah, I wonder, if Bonnie's a plant and asking this question, because it's actually amazingly, it's hilarious too, on the healing waters question is kind of tying the two together. But yeah, this has been such a rewarding experience, both for me as an educator. I like to think my students as aspiring historians, and then I hope for the Historical Society in terms of, getting content that people can, appreciate and enjoy. We hope to kind of continue this kind of on an annual, semi-annual basis. As every year I teach the podcasting class, we'll be making podcasts for the Historical Society. And, the idea I've kicked around with a couple of folks there already is that if the water exhibit is reopening in the fall, I'm teaching this class again in the fall, that maybe we can do a series about water in some way and tracing out in its various ways. If I had my pick, it would just be 7 episodes about Milwaukee hockey. It's frozen water, right? But I'm sure there are some other things we can look at as well.
Cool. Well, before we adjourn, where can people find it? We have it at our website, milwaukeehistory.net/podcast. Where else if that's too cumbersome for people?
Yeah. So it might be easiest. If you are unfamiliar with podcasting apps, the Historical Society's website might just be the easiest. It's milwaukeehistory.net/podcast, and all of the episodes are there, as well as some material that fell on the cutting room floor. Like images. You can't put images in a podcast, so we put them all on the blog posts for each episode. But and again, this is where the Historical Society was really key, because they partnered with us and were committed to getting this on every single platform that was available. So wherever you get podcasts, you should be able to find this episode or find the show. It's called The Healthiest City, which we should acknowledge is a title that we borrowed from a historian who wrote a book of the same name that kind of really helped us understand this period, and she's featured on the show. She gave her consent for us to use the show. So Judith Levitt, who wrote a book called The Healthiest City, which is a long history of Milwaukee's public health department, if you're interested in that. So yeah, get them wherever you get your podcasts, and hopefully this is the first of many seasons. Hopefully about rosier topics, though. That'd be nice.
And a lot easier execution of
made in person. Please
Right.
and thank you.
Less Zoom and phone interviews, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up. So thank you to Professor Chris Cantwell from UWM and graduate students Christina and Ken for offering us your knowledge on this topic. It's cool because you guys you became experts on this through this process, which is always kind of a neat experience that way too. So thanks so much for joining us tonight, and I hope that everybody can listen to it because it really is really well done. So make sure you hit MilwaukeeHistory.net/podcast at nothing else than to see the work. I do want to just give a quick plug for next week. We have women's baseball in Milwaukee and the Midwest. And that's 7:30 again next Thursday. So we hope that you can join us for that one. And until then, everybody stay safe, stay healthy. If you can get vaccinated, I encourage you to do so. Otherwise, we'll see you again soon. Take it easy.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.